Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Humanitarian webinar. My name is Brendan Cahill. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs at Fordham University. The Institute is an independent center reporting directly to the president of the university and acts as a bridge between the humanitarian and academic sectors. We achieve this through training in both our undergraduate and our graduate programs, through our research, most especially on design for humanity, education in emergencies, and children in armed conflict. And the joy, I would say, of the most recent joy that we've had is offering these weekly webinars. And we're joined today in hosting this by the Leitner Center for Human Rights. And I would like to welcome my co-host, Elizabeth Wickery, the Executive Director of the Leitner Center, who will then introduce the program. Liz.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Welcome, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm so glad to be here today for the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice at Fordham, joining the Institute and hosting the launch of such an important work. As Brendan noted, I am the Executive Director of the Leitner Center, and I'll just say a word or two about what we do for those of you not familiar with us. Like the Institute, we're housed at Fordham. We're based at the law school, and we are an innovative think and do tank aiming to make international human rights protections an everyday reality for marginalized communities across the globe through the use of international law. We're a hands-on advocacy team providing education and training for law students and future human rights lawyers. We also facilitate capacity building and advocacy with activists and grassroots groups around the world. And we contribute to critical research among legal scholars in international human rights. As part of this work, we have partnered with organizations working on refugee rights, the topic of our conversation today, and examined international refugee law as applied in places such as North Korea, South Africa, along the Myanmar-Thai border, and in the United States, among other countries. But I am, like you, eager to learn more about the unique considerations for Palestinian refugees. And with that in mind, let me introduce our speakers today, who are also the authors of the important and updated book, Palestinian Refugees in International Law, the second edition. I do want to note before introducing our speakers that we will be providing a link where you can purchase the book. And after I introduce the speakers, I'll hand it over to them. They'll speak, and then you will have an opportunity to ask questions using the chat function. And Brendan and I will help to moderate a conversation after the presentation. Our authors are Francesca Albanese. She's a research affiliate for the study of international migration at Georgetown University and a visiting scholar at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Studies and Policies and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. She's an international lawyer specializing in human rights and refugee issues in the Arab world, and she has 15 years of professional experience working with the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the European Union, the UNDP, and a range of NGOs. Our other speaker is Dr. Lex Takkenberg, who has worked with UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, from 1989 until late last year, and is currently a freelance lecturer and consultant. He is the former chief of the UNRWA Ethics Office, and prior to that, he held positions including its general counsel, director of operations, and deputy field director in Gaza and Syria. Before joining that organization, he was the legal officer of the Dutch Refugee Council for 6 years. So I can't think of two better speakers to help inform us about this issue. And of course, the authors of this important new book. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Takkenberg.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth and Brandon, and greetings from Vienna. I see on my screen that I have an unstable internet connection, although it's supposed to be good, but I guess it's overload due to the latest closure in Austria. Can you hear me okay? I hope you can hear me. Francesca and I are, yes, good. Francesca and I are very honored to have this opportunity to present our book today. Let me begin by thanking the Institute for International Humanitarian Affairs and the Fordham University Law School's Leitner Center for International Law and Justice for hosting the event, and to all of you for joining us today. When I wrote the first edition of the book in the 1990s, originally my PhD thesis, there was already a lot of literature about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including legal works, but very little specifically about the people at the heart of the conflict, the Palestinian refugees. As a young lawyer, working with the Dutch Refugee Council first, and then with UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, I had considerable difficulty in understanding why Palestinian refugees were the only group of forced displaced with a different treatment to other refugees under the international refugee regime. The book I wrote in 1998 was the first attempt to comprehensively analyze the various legal aspects of the Palestinian refugee question and their distinct status in international law. The first edition, written at the time of the Middle East peace process, reflected the optimism of the time, including the expectation of the establishment of a Palestinian state, which many believed would help resolve the refugee question. This optimism proved unfounded, and almost every political development since the Oslo breakthrough has adversely affected Palestinians, both those under the yoke of the Israeli occupation in the Gaza Strip, West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the refugees at large. One of the few more positive developments brought about by the Middle East peace process has been the increase of legal literature and research on the Palestinian refugee question by scholars and practitioners and Palestinian refugee organizations like Badil in the West Bank. However, this new research focused on either the situation of Palestinian refugees in specific countries, for example in Lebanon or in Egypt, on their specific rights, for example, right of return, right to compensation, or on the protection gap affecting them owing to the exceptional regime embodied by UNRWA, and formerly the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, as opposed to UNHCR for other refugees. An updated analysis of the Palestinian refugee question as a whole, looking holistically at historical, legal, and political aspects, continued to be missing. Also, at a time of increasing attacks against UNRWA, which disingenuously included attacks against the very existence of the Palestinian refugees, the difficulty of researching UNRWA for people who had not experienced it from within was an obstacle to fully appreciate both challenges and opportunities of the regime set up for these refugees. And so it was that whilst continuing to work with UNRWA, it gradually dawned on me that it would be important to update the book. As I dreaded having to embark on years of solitary confinement once again to accomplish the task, I decided to look for a co-author. That turned out to be a complex undertaking, as I needed a good international lawyer with a solid understanding of the question of Palestine and the Palestinian refugee issue, but also an excellent researcher and networker, as there was a lot of new literature and many more were engaged on the issue than 20 years ago. Last but not least, I needed someone with their heart in the right place. Having worked with Francesca during her tenure with UNRWA, I felt that she might fit the profile. Though it took patience and perseverance to convince her to accept my proposal, she rapidly proved out to be the perfect choice. Not only did she agree to be my partner in crime, she also accepted to act as the principal author, taking the lead in the drafting of what essentially became a new book, reflecting the wealth of developments and knowledge that we were able to tap into. For me, the experience was totally different than the mostly solitary exercise of writing the first edition. My role this time was to offer strategic support, to brainstorm with Francesca on how to tackle the dilemmas we encountered on the way, to review the various drafts, but also to tap into my extensive network of academic and other contacts relevant to the book. The result is a much better, much richer book. As she has been the lead author, it is only fair that I ask Francesca to present the book to you. Francesca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lex, for the very kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. Greetings from Jakarta. I would also like to thank you all for making this event possible and being with us today. I admit that when Lex first approached me to produce a new edition of his seminal work of 1998, I was intimidated by what looked too daunting a task. However, I was convinced that more had to be said about the legal dimension of the Palestinian refugee question, especially linking its various political, legal, and historical dimensions. Especially since my years in UNRWA, I had personally witnessed how much confusion around Palestinian refugee status and their rights as refugees and stateless persons, among others, could impact the life of millions of them. I observed the recurrence of discrimination against Palestinian refugees. Sometimes discrimination was manifest and institutionalized, as in many Arab countries. Sometimes it's just more obscure and muted. And at times, it's linked simply to genuine confusion about who Palestinian refugees are and what international protection entails in their case. Confusion, though, often provides support to those who manipulate legal arguments to advance a political agenda at the expense of these refugees. So this new book offered us a unique opportunity to contribute to the debate around the Palestinian refugee question, building on the research that Lex referred to that had germinated on the topic from various disciplines, clarifying legal areas that remained misunderstood, and ultimately bringing the Palestinian refugee question and their unmet rights to the fore. So like the first edition, the book aims to offer a comprehensive overview of the Palestinian refugee question in international law, including its origins and evolution, the special arrangements that the UN put in place for them, and the extent to which international law is relevant to their protection and the pursuit of solutions in theory and in practice. We enriched the work that had been done for the first edition with new archival, doctrinal, and field research, with an extensive survey of the Palestinian refugees' experience across the fragmentation of the exile, surveying national and regional practices, jurisprudence, and case law across the 5 continents, and a holistic approach to international law, focusing on specific challenges and ways to overcome them, as well as of opportunities that remained untapped. We have no illusion that international law per se cannot provide an easy way out of the current impasse in the Israel-Palestine situation, but we approach it as an indispensable way to challenge the current state of affairs and reestablish a principled order at various levels. So in essence, the book we wrote is a new book building on the foundation of the first edition. It contains many new findings, but in the interest of time, I will give you an impressionistic overview of 4 main areas of novelty. First, compared to the first edition, this new book looks deeper and in a more organic fashion at the events that befell Palestine and its people from the last days of the Ottoman Empire, so not from 1948, as many legal books do. We look at the Ottoman Empire when political Zionism laid its ambitions on this land through the decades of the British Mandate of Palestine till the unrest and war in 1947-1949 triggered by the UN plan to partition Palestine between the majority indigenous Arabs and the Jews, mostly of whom were from Europe and Palestine, of course, and through the Israeli occupation of what remained of Palestine that commenced in 1967 to the present day's dispersal. We systematically discuss numbers, waves of arrival, status and treatment of Palestinian refugees, or rather Palestinian in the diaspora at large, in over 50 countries in the Arab world, but also in Europe, the Americas, the Asia Pacific and Africa, where numbers of Palestinian refugees are increasingly moving. The overview of the Palestinian dispersal that we offer is, to our knowledge, the most complete currently available. We warn the reader that the lack of proper recording of Palestinian refugees in national systems often makes them statistically invisible, and the lack of accessible, reliable data in certain countries blurs the overall picture. But hopefully, this will inspire further research, including on the discrimination they endure and their consequences. For example, little discusses the fact that at least 700,000 Palestinian refugees, on top of the over 750,000 who were displaced in 1947-49, and on top of the 400,000 that were displaced in 1967, again, at least 700 Palestinian refugees, mainly children and grandchildren of the original displaced in 1948, have been cumulatively displaced, often in the context of outright persecution from within the Arab world from the 1970s onward, following tragic turns of events like in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Kuwait and other Gulf countries, Libya, and more recently, Iraq and Syria. And this doesn't take into account the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that Israel has additionally displaced since 1967. So together with increasing hardship in accessing international protection in Europe, North America, the hostility in Arab world in pushing Palestinian refugees toward new frontiers of exile, Palestinians found themselves anew at loss. One example is Southeast Asia, where I live, where Palestinians arrive anew as refugees, experiencing all sorts of old and new challenges, and without coping mechanism as traditional ports of call for them would offer. The legal overview, intertwined with these historical excursus, is important not only to understand who Palestinian refugees are and how they became the largest and allegedly the most intractable refugee situation of modern times, but also to appreciate the continuity between the original Palestinian displacement and present-day reality in the occupied Palestine, but also everywhere where the dispersal has taken them and the challenges they experience as a result. Second, the book provides a new critical analysis of the distinctive regime set up by the United Nations for Palestinian refugees within the International Refugee Framework. And this is a key issue, also misinterpreted, including in the US debate. So I will spend some extra words on it. So let's start by some apparent facts. First, unlike any other refugees today, Palestinian refugees at large do not fall under UNHCR's mandate, but rather UNRWA's mandate. Second, unlike any other refugees today, Palestinian refugees at large do not fall within the purview of Article 1A(2) of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which, for the non-lawyers in the audience, is the article which defines refugees as person being outside their country and unable or unwilling to return out of fear of persecution. Palestinian refugees at large fall under Article 1D of the same convention, which is commonly and erroneously referred to as excluding to core outright Palestinian refugees from the protection of the Refugee Convention. These facts have led to one of the greatest misconceptions in refugee studies, that Palestinian refugees are lesser refugees than others, and therefore they are entitled to different or no protection as refugees at all. And this is factually and legally wrong. Palestinian refugees were displaced en masse from historical Palestine in connection with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and subsequent events such in 1967, including their descendants, are protracted refugees under international law precisely by virtue of Article 1D. And please bear with me here. This article, in a nutshell, provisionally excludes from the benefit of the Convention refugees who are assisted and protected by other UN agencies. It means other than UNHCR, but extend them protection, the benefit of the Convention, whenever the alternative arrangements that have been made for them are no longer applicable or cease before their situation is definitely settled. I admit that the wording of this article is quite obscure, but its meaning makes full sense when interpreted in line with the drafting history of the Refugee Convention, which is a legal tool for treaty interpretation, as you know. In short, Article 1D is foundational to the status of Palestinian refugees in international law and reflects simply their distinctiveness within, again I underscore, within the international refugee framework. This distinctiveness has historical and political reasons. In 1949, while the drafting of the 1951 Convention and UNHCR stated was being finalized, the General Assembly, with Resolution 194 of 1948, had already decided how to resolve the conflict in Palestine by establishing the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, UNCCP, the body that Lex mentioned in the beginning, with the aim of negotiating a solution to the conflict over Palestine, including the refugee problem. And second, a scheme for durable solutions for Palestinian refugees, through the returns of those willing to live at peace with their Jewish neighbors and the provision of compensation for those choosing to resettle elsewhere. And all these scheme for durable solutions had to be facilitated by the UNCCP. Because peace between Israel and the Arab states proved unattainable in the short term, other mechanisms were created to provide urgently needed relief to the refugees. The most lasting one of those is UNRWA. UNRWA's original functions were geared toward material assistance to the refugees, and this is something which is commonly known and repeated, but also to support UNCCP's work towards solutions, durable solutions. And this is how the alternative arrangements came into existence. All the more, like most refugees from World War II, who at the time of the 1951 Refugee Convention was adopted were still to be admitted in safe countries, Palestinians had been given de facto asylum in other countries, and they didn't want to be resettled out of their homeland. The majority of them wanted to return. So their protection entailed return to their homes, while also preserving the properties and assets they had left behind and providing them assistance to be resettled or compensated if they wish to so. So this is something that, as I said, UNCCP and UNRWA had already been precisely geared to do. So the situation was recognized by the drafters of the 1951 Convention, which saw no interest in duplicating, but also provided that should these arrangements no longer work, before the question of Palestinian refugees is definitely settled, then the convention, and so UNHCR regime would apply. So in a nutshell, the 1951 convention did not mean to exclude Palestinian refugees from the realm of internationally protected refugees, but just provided that their protection and assistance would be taken care of by others, UNCCP and UNRWA. And this is why there was one question asked before the panel started to us. It's not possible to simply imagine to absorb UNRWA under UNHCR, because they are both subsidiary bodies of the UN General Assembly. They report to the General Assembly, and UNRWA's mandate is tied to the realization of Resolution 194, so the scheme for durable solution for Palestinian refugees. So one other aspect I think that the novelty of our analysis brings to the fore is that if analyzed in the context of other refugee situation of 70 years ago, the Palestinian refugee situation looks all but exceptional, because 70 years ago, ad hoc responses to refugee crisis were quite normal. And indeed, even the 1951 convention was initially only envisaged for European and then Soviet Union refugees. The territorial partitions generated refugee crises such as the Palestinian, the Korean, the Indian, Pakistani, were all beyond the scope of the Refugee Convention and UNHCR. The only exception is that, unlike these others, partition-generated refugee crisis, the Palestinian has yet to be resolved. The Palestinians have yet to enjoy a full sovereign independent state, and many have remained in a limbo with no return, no resettlement, and mostly stateless. So in light of all these, we invested quite a bit of time on clarifying who is a Palestinian refugees under international law, debunking the myth that there is no definition of who Palestinian refugees are. Protected under international law are those who were displaced in connection with the 1948 and 1967 events and their descendants, and their question is still not settled in line with relevant UN resolutions. You appreciate that UNCCP is an incredibly important actor and is not adequately known and understood. This is why people normally struggle to appreciate UNRWA. UNRWA's mandate is half of the story, half of the international protection that was designed for Palestinian refugees. However, in the 1960s, and for political reasons, in our view, UNCCP was fatally demised. Since then, we have assisted to a significant evolution of UNRWA's function and its cooperation with UNHCR to better assist Palestinian refugees. Both agencies interpret their mandate vis-a-vis Palestinian refugees as complementary rather than antithetical or contradictory. Accordingly, UNRWA is responsible for Palestine refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, and UNHCR become responsible for them, and then I can elaborate on that if you like in the Q&A, when they find themselves in need for international protection outside UNRWA's areas of operation for objective reasons. So certainly the system is not fully effective and must be improved, and the book includes an articulate critique of it. But until now, the debate regarding protection of Palestinian refugees has largely been consumed by UNRWA being unequipped or ill-equipped to protect Palestinian refugees, and these being parts and parcel of the protection gap for Palestinian refugees. We try to overcome this, and after analyzing the evolution of both UNRWA and UNHCR's protection role and potential vis-a-vis Palestinian refugees, and their little known strategic cooperation, we propose a number of measures for both agencies with their respective spheres of competence to set in motion a more watertight protection regime for Palestinian refugees. We hope that other scholars and practitioners will constructively join this debate. Third, the book provides the first in-depth analysis of the Palestinian refugee questions in light of various areas of international law and their interplay. We try to counter, as Professor Ardim Seyis notes, one of the great paradoxes of the progressive development of international law over the past 70 years, made of the gradual expansion of international law through various branches or subfields of international law, which enabled international law to have a greater impact on many aspects of life, as humanitarian law and human rights law, but also contributed to fragmented discipline. So expertise tends to be cultivated in subdisciplines, and it becomes difficult to fully appreciate how different branches of international law naturally interplay. And the Palestinian refugee case is one in point. We have discussed how various bodies of law are relevant to them in general, and their interplay is key to their protection. For example, we have discussed, because the Palestinian refugee question is historical in nature, has spanned over 70 years. So we have looked at international humanitarian law, given the fact that not only the Palestinian refugee question was born out of conflict, but also because conflicts have afflicted the experience of many Palestinian refugees in the OPT, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and beyond. The implication of international humanitarian law violations may be relevant to those seeking redress and accountability, for example, including through universal jurisdiction. Second, we look at the law concerning statelessness, which is important not only to the refugees who were denationalized en masse by Israel, I think in 1952, in violation of prevailing principles of international law of state succession in force at the time, but also because the enduring statelessness of most Palestinians since 1948 largely occurs for political reasons. Third, we analyze how international human rights law potentially offers the broadest scope of protection to Palestinian refugees who are in a protracted refugee situation, especially those living in countries that have not ratified the 1951 convention, but where human rights treaties like the Convention Against Torture, or civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child are largely ratified with important implications for them. The recommendations of treaty bodies and special procedures with regard to Palestinian refugees that we have carefully studied both in Arab countries and in Europe provide an important tool to ensure greater scrutiny of national practices vis-à-vis Palestinian refugees. Fourth, with regard to international refugee law, in addition to explaining the regime set up by Article 1D, hoping for greater coherence around it, the book explores the significance of recent developments in refugee law and practice to Palestinian refugees to break the political impasse. And this is the fourth and last point, which I will go to in a minute, but I would like to make another comment. In light of on this third area, in light of the various branches or of international law that I mentioned above, the book also offers an in-depth analysis of many of the rights of Palestinian refugees, such as the right of self-determination, which is not common in refugee studies, the right of return, right of compensation, and right to restitutions, but also civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights, which again is an analysis that it's often missing. And eventually, I was saying in the fourth area is that the book explores what resolving the question of Palestinian refugees in international law may look like by using the development in refugee law and practice. These parts represent a fundamental departure from the first edition, in the sense that the hope that the Middle East peace process could offer a solution to the Palestinian refugee question is dead. Our main premise is that after 7 decades of unsuccessful attempts at resolving the refugee issue, a fundamental paradigm shift in the approach to solutions for Palestinian refugees is needed. And we foresee 3 steps. We argue that the UN must assume responsibility for the pursuit of solutions for Palestinian refugees, like it ultimately does for other refugee crises, including large and protracted one. Because eventually, since Oslo, the Palestinian refugee issue has become dominated by the asymmetry of power between the parties. And even before, political expedient has prevailed over the interest of the refugees, and this situation must end. Second, like with other refugee situations, international law must be the framework and the lighthouse for resolving the various aspects of the Palestinian refugee question. The issue of ending refugee status, as well as moral, material, individual and collective justice, is to be addressed. And third, our proposed paradigm shift addresses the long-held belief that pursuing solutions for Palestinian refugees more holistically, meaning having a human rights approach to their situation, would undermine Palestinian rights and their claims toward Israel, and as such would jeopardize the Palestinian cause. We discussed this with American anthropologist Neil Gabian, as the politics of suffering that have trapped Palestinian refugees. We make it clear that this is not the case, because for Palestinian refugees, the right to return, restitution and compensation flow from the historical injustice that accompanied the birth of the refugee issues. And these have only become stronger with the passing of time and the further advancement of international law. We suggest a multidimensional response to advance this paradigm shift that takes into account various dimensions, where the innovative part, compared to the past, is as much in the process as in the substance. I would like to stop here because I know that Lex would like to share some concluding remarks on this issue.
Thank you very much, Francesca. And yes, I will conclude our presentation with a few remarks on how we concretely propose to or see an opening to realize this paradigm shift. We argue in the book that the 2016 New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2016 in response to the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War, provides an opportunity to move forward with respect to Palestinian refugees. The declaration constitutes a powerful political reaffirmation of the international refugee regime that was put in place after the Second World War and subsequent decades, including the centrality of international law in protecting the human rights and fundamental freedoms of refugees, and the approach in promoting durable solutions for refugee situations. The declaration underscores the importance of a systemic and comprehensive response in addressing refugee questions. It calls, amongst other things, for the development of a comprehensive refugee response framework to each large-scale refugee situation, including protracted ones. These comprehensive refugee response frameworks, and there is a template attached to the New York Declaration, are to be developed through a multi-stakeholder approach with a key role for national and local authorities, international organizations, international financial institutions, civil society, and last but not least, the refugees themselves. It also calls for addressing all aspects of a refugee response, including root causes, ending refugee status and statelessness through a combination of durable solutions, and finally, humanitarian assistance to refugees. The New York Declaration applies to all refugees, including Palestinian refugees, as appears from a number of references therein to UNRWA. In spite of this, to date, no such framework has been developed for Palestinian refugees. We suggest that this lacuna be addressed at the earliest opportunity, with UNRWA and UNHCR facilitating the process together, each with respect to the Palestinian refugees for which it is responsible. Francesca has already referred to that. We believe that a comprehensive response framework for Palestinian refugees, developed under Palestinian leadership, including refugee groups and diaspora networks across the world, has the potential of ending Palestinian exceptionalism and allows for a 72-year-old refugee question to be approached anew with a state-of-the-art 21st century toolbox. One may wonder what such framework would add to the multiple peace efforts that have been undertaken since the late 1940s, or how it would be different from them. The answer, we believe, is as much in the very elements of the comprehensive refugee response framework for Palestinian refugees that we propose in the book, as well as in the process of its development. Here are some of its key components. In our view, the framework should first and foremost reaffirm the legal regime applicable to the Palestinian refugee question, comprised of relevant norms of international law, including relevant UN resolutions, specifying their meaning and implications. As Francesca indicated, the international law has frequently got on the back burner in pursuing the refugee question, and we believe this needs to change, and it would address the first element of our suggested paradigm shift and pave the way to a rights-based discourse on both protection and solution, reconciling the right to return with the right to apply for asylum and citizenship in other countries, which has been absent for way too long. New York Declaration, this is the second element, underscores the importance of addressing the root causes of any large-scale displacement. And as such, the development of the framework for Palestinian refugees could provide a setting to initiate, under a UN aegis, public discussion on the Palestinian refugee question. This would include both its origins and constituting elements. We refer to this as the past, as well as the broader context of the unresolved dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, including the question of self-determination, i.e. the present. Thirdly, addressing the Palestinian refugee question within the framework of international law means aligning the search for solutions with the international refugee law and practice. The combination of the durable solutions has helped resolve other protracted refugee situations and could help do so for Palestinian refugees as well. This would not mean relinquishing the right of return, but creating a basis and space for the refugees themselves to discuss its significance whilst exploring solutions more holistically. Finally, the framework will have to address the important issue of restitution and compensation. Francesca was already referring to it, on which there has been way too little progress, despite the important work done by the UNCCP and other technical aspects to evaluate property left behind in 1948. With respect to the development of I've so far spoken about some of the key elements. With respect to the development of a comprehensive response framework for Palestinian refugee, as already mentioned, the New York Declaration calls for a multi-stakeholder approach. And this is what has been absent so far in the Palestinian case. In the Palestinian case, this would require the mobilization of a wide and diverse front of those invested in the framework, including the UN, host countries, both in UNRWA's area of operations and other countries that host significant numbers of Palestinian refugees, donor representatives, and civil society. The Palestinian political leadership and the refugees must have a central and leading role in this process. It should entail consultation at the national, regional, and international levels, structured engagement with refugees in host countries, and exploration of the feasibility of various solutions and other measures. In conclusion, we have no illusion that it is going to be easy to move forward, but we believe strongly that this approach would have the potential to give new impetus to international action in favor of Palestinian refugees and their rights. This does not need to await and could help advance a more positive outlook for the wider political process. On that note, I give the floor back to Elizabeth, I think.
No, I'll take this one, Lex.
Okay.
First, just to thank you and Francesca for a really insightful presentation on what has been and what could be. As you note, in 1948, with the birth of UNRWA, 50 years later, you came out with the first edition of this book. 22 years later, and now the second edition. After another 22 years, if we were to look forward, do you see the political will to take up some of your recommendations, even under the next 2 years? Do you see the next? We seem to live in a very cynical world when it pertains to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. So that's to either of you.
You want me to respond to that straight away?
Yes, please.
I'm always saying that I'm a naive optimist, so I tend to think that progress is possible, and I definitely believe that with the levers that we elaborate in the book, you know, taking advantage of sort of the global international refugee and applying it where applicable to the question of Palestinian refugees, has the potential to provide new openings and opportunities, and that's what very much sort of drove us to write this new edition. Yeah, indeed, when I wrote the first edition, it was in the middle of the Oslo process, and I thought, oh my God, you know, this book will end up with sort of second-hand booksellers quite rapidly, and so unfortunately the reality turned out to be different. I mean, what I personally believe in terms of progress, and I think what has been brought home to us when we researched and wrote the new edition, is that really the current situation is not sustainable. Effectively in Israel and Palestine, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, there is effectively a situation of apartheid. There's one government that is ruling two people, granting all possible rights to one, denying the most basic rights to the other. That has not, that situation of structural injustice has not been sustainable in other parts of the world, and it will not be sustainable in the question of Israel and Palestine. I'm strongly convinced about, and the pressure and the changes in discourse are sort of presenting themselves. I mean, and I have no illusion that it will be easy in the Israeli body politic. There has been a dramatic shift to the right, but to the point that current mainstream politicians, and I believe, are overreaching their hand in their belief that they can sort of manage rather than solve this conflict. And sooner rather than later, it will somehow explode, and a new discourse will set in, as it has in South Africa and other parts of the world. And there's already an increasing call on sort of equal rights for Palestinians and Israelis in one binational state, and whether that will materialize is to be seen. But it's very clear for me that this institutional injustice will not prevail, and then this happens in a situation where the balance of power globally and regionally is quite dramatically shifting, which will also bear upon the extent to which Israel can continue to impose the status quo without a prospect of solutions, or whether there will be pressures to move forward. So I'm cautiously optimistic that hopefully by the time there may not be a need for a third edition, and if there is to be a third edition, it's one where the rights-based discourse towards a resolution has continued to gain traction.
Thank you, Lex. I'm aware of time, and I want to pass over to my co-host, Elizabeth Wickery, to handle some of the others. So Liz, I know you have a number of questions to our panelists.
Sure, yeah, and thank you, both of you, so much for the interesting presentation. There are a couple of questions that came through about a kind of technical questions about the 1951 convention, and I think in response, Francesca, to your comments there. But I'm going to take advantage of the floor and just ask one other broad question, and that's, you talked at the end, Lex, about the New York Declaration and the call for a multi-stakeholder approach, a sort of comprehensive approach. And for Francesca, bearing in mind your comments about the need to center law as a way to sort of move forward positively. How do you see that fitting in with this kind of rise of nationalism internationally, and the sort of prominence, I think Lex sort of started to hint at some of this, but the prominence of more authoritarian style leadership that tends to shy away from internationalization and focuses more on domestic issues. So, if at the end of 2020 we leave behind some of that, from the vantage point perhaps of some countries where some of us may be sitting, is there hope that we're starting to come out of that trend? Or how do you see a multi-stakeholder approach fitting in without positive leadership looking to centering law from key countries?
Lex, shall I take this question? Because it probably allows me to elaborate and share my view on on the question that Brendan raised. I don't know if I'm an optimist as Lex. I mean, if I look at the political process, the way it's led, and what the rulers decide, I cannot be optimistic. But in my personal experience, in my years in DC, for example, in Washington, DC, I met so many, I mean, a new and sort of a new generation of Jewish Americans, and they, I mean, I was shocked because I was not expecting such openness and such support for the cause of justice in the Israel-Palestine case. In my experience with Palestinian refugees, I've met so many youth, and the last year I spent after submitting this manuscript, I've worked with Palestinian refugee youth, and the hope and wisdom that comes from them, the alternative political approaches they bring with themselves gives me hope. I mean, there are new generations, and sooner or later they will take over, and I do see them carrying a new liberalism that I mean, I belong to the to a sort of middle generation between the current ruling setting and them, and I do see hope. In this sense, there is a dichotomy, there is a polarization of let's say the different parties, not only in the Israeli-Palestinian case. This is just emblematic of an approach of, I mean, between West and the rest of the world, between global North and global South. But at the same time, I do think that we the multi-stakeholder approach, going to Elizabeth's question, is the way to give a voice to those. It's not that they are voiceless, to those who are normally unheard. It's to create a platform, for example, where Palestinian refugees have a voice beyond what is decided by the PA. And this is not to rule out the PA role, if you see what I mean. It's just to give everyone a representation in this process, and it is to be bottom up.
Thank you. I'll move to a couple of the technical questions we received. Francesca, you spent some time in your presentation talking about Article 1D of the 1951 Convention, and there were two questions that came through about specific phrases within Article 1D, and whether or not those phrases offer us more arguments for why Palestinian refugees should indeed receive broader protections under that convention. The first is whether the phrase "at present," referring to at the time at which the convention was adopted, whether that provides some argument to say that anyone born to Palestinian refugees after 1951 may indeed be eligible for the range of protections that the convention provides because of that term "at present." The second question that I'll pose at the same time so you can address them together is there was a question as to whether it can be truthfully stated that UNRWA provides protection and assistance. So if Article 1D excludes those who are receiving protection and assistance from other agencies, can we truly say that Palestinian refugees are receiving protection given the range of personal and physical security risks that Palestinians live with, and that UNRWA cannot actually protect against?
All right, so first of all, yes, at present, so first of all, I would like to point out that there is a very enlightening guidance on Article 1D that was put forward by UNHCR in 2017. UNHCR since 2002 has elaborated interpretation on the application of Article 1D, clarifying issues that were unclear. But the 2017 note, I encourage everyone dealing with this issue or interested, is worth looking at because it's definitely the most comprehensive and elaborates also on jurisprudence on the issue. And there is no doubt that at present means currently receiving, which doesn't, I mean, is interpreted in different way. I mean, that means that the Palestinian refugee is to be in direct avail of the services provided by UNRWA or entitled to. And in UNHCR's interpretation, and which in our view is correct, it's that the Palestinian refugee who's entitled, not necessarily receiving. It can be a person who has never set foot in UNRWA's areas of operation. It falls under the scope of Article 1D, paragraph 1. So the issue that this was only applied to the refugees before 1951, it's not supported by I mean, it's old interpretation and it's not supported at the moment. Sorry, you asked me a second question regarding if there is if it's a serious statement that UNRWA delivers protection to Palestinian refugees. I mean, it's a very complex issue, and I don't want to make it trivial by reducing it to to a couple of sentences in this regard. What we have done in the book is to analyze the evolution of protection to Palestinian refugees through UNCCP, UNRWA, and also UNHCR mandate since 1948. What was intended and what has become true. And we discussed this against the background of the evolution of international protection as concept and also looking at UNHCR's mandate. One thing I would like you to retain is that UN agencies' mandates evolve for what Professor Guy Goodwin-Gill calls a humanitarian necessity to fill a vacuum. Human necessity, sorry, to fill a humanitarian vacuum. UNHCR's mandate has evolved in this respect, responding to that need, and so has UNRWA. The point is that UNRWA, compared to UNHCR, has suffered much more political pressure, and so it. I mean, I do argue that UNRWA doesn't interpret the protection mandate that the UN intended for Palestinian refugees, which included UNCCP's functions, as it should. But again, this is not necessarily a criticism directed at UNRWA, but the political establishment that doesn't allow UNRWA to function as it should. And they challenge a little bit the statement that UNRWA is not able to provide physical protection because it's very difficult for UN agency other than ICRC, for example, to provide physical protection. But what is the role of states? I mean, we cannot expect a UN agency to solve a political process which so intense human rights ramification. We need to act on the root causes first and foremost. And yes, help UNRWA deliver a stronger mandate toward Palestinian refugees.
Thank you so much. I feel as though I'm in a masterclass on international refugee law. So this is really excellent. And I'm sure there's, obviously much more in the book that we can learn from. We received a couple more questions that I'll pose together and then turn over to you for final comments, because as ever, these events are far too short to get to everything. One is just in relation to your last comment about UNRWA itself. This may again be hearkening back to my earlier question about the rise of nationalism, but given the cuts in funding from the Trump administration to UNRWA and the the upcoming change in administration, I wonder if you have any comments about the importance of funding and the impacts that that has had. And then I think slightly related to that, I know your book came out in the midst of the pandemic, and so it probably is unable to address this, but I was so interested to hear your comments about the importance of, broadly, of international human rights law for the protection of Palestinian refugees. And you mentioned specifically economic, social, and cultural rights. So I wonder if you could also make a couple of comments about, what the impact of COVID has been, whether or not there are protections available to Palestinian refugees from economic and social and cultural rights protections. And then with that, I'll leave it to both of you, Lex and Francesca, to wrap up with any final comments.
Francesca, you first want to go on the socio-economic and cultural
Yeah,
rights?
let me address the second question. So yes, in the issue of economic, social, and rights like civil and political rights, and we make a huge case for it in the book. And I have three comments on this. The first is that the situation was already dramatic prior to the COVID, because look at the situation where UNRWA operates, like 13-year blockaded Gaza, which has also suffered 3 wars and continuous military attacks. An occupation with continuous settler violence and infringement of human rights, serious infringements of human rights in the West Bank, war-torn Syria, and spiraling down Lebanon. Jordan is still safe, but this is the context in which most Palestinian refugees live. And it's quite dramatic. Outside of this, of UNRWA's areas of operation, we have observed that the human rights indicators for Palestinian refugees in the rest of the Arab world have increasingly deteriorated over the last 10, 15 years, and mainly for political reasons. And this is what is pushing Palestinian refugees outside of the Arab world. And because North America and Europe, the alternative ports of call, have closed their doors mostly to new refugees or there is no other ports of call for Palestinians than Asian countries or Asia Pacific or Africa. So they need to, there is a need to look at resolving the human rights situation of these people, because this will mean empowerment for them and creating also a critical mass for them to shape their future instead of depending on others to speak on their behalf. So the COVID, what I know is that the COVID situation is worsening the situation in UNRWA's country dramatically. In other countries, we have no data.
Exactly, and as an organization, UNRWA, through its 30,000 Palestinian staff, its teachers, its doctors, its nurses, its counselors, social workers, and so forth, has been able to sort of overnight adjust yet again to provide sort of first-hand COVID support to Palestinian refugees in its area of operation, in spite of the funding challenges that the organization has faced. Yes, there have been huge problems as a result of the cut of the American funding. America was traditionally the biggest donor, and that was a huge challenge for the organization, which is not over. The current Commissioner General of UNRWA has just written a week ago that for the first time, as I can remember, and I worked for the organization for 30 years, the organization will not be able to pay full salary at the end of this month, with the hope that the remaining of the salary can be paid as soon as extra donor contributions come in. So this is very, very tragic. Of course, there is hope that with the upcoming change of administration, U.S. funding may be restored, but it's still. I've been saying for many years that for an organization whose mandate has become basic provision of public services in the domains of education, health, and social services, a budget that is voluntary funded is not adequate. For an education system and a primary healthcare system, you need to have a budgetary allotment that increases as a function of population growth and inflation. And so there is a mismatch between what the UN General Assembly expects from UNRWA and the way it funds the organization. That has tragically led to a lot of additional hardship for the Palestinian refugees. Then again, coming back just as a closing remark, in terms of, yes, we see the cynicism in the region, we see the rise of nationalism and populism, and in the short term, no leadership to really drive things forward. That's why we believe that the New York Declaration is so interesting as a potential lever to inject some new thinking on the discourse around Palestinian refugees. because it is an existing powerful political mandate to move forward, in the sense that the New York Declaration was unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly in September 2016 with 0 abstentions. It instructs the UN to develop comprehensive frameworks for all refugee situations, all large-scale refugee situations, including protracted ones. Palestinian refugees are included under the mandate, or under the scope of the declaration. So there is a mandate. It's only now a question of operationalizing the mandate. In the case of other refugee situations, UNHCR has sort of been the facilitator. In the case of Palestinian refugees, we believe that, and we suggest that UNHCR and UNRWA do this hand in hand. Now, UNHCR has not correctly taken the initiative to take the lead, and UNRWA has faced not only a huge financial crisis, but also a leadership crisis, as a result of which things have not moved forward. So we do hope that Palestinians, that international community, and that some visionary leadership around the Secretary General of the UN can operationalize this mandate in favor of Palestinian refugees. And then more generally I am reminded in the presentations around the book of my professor of international law when I was studying international law at the University of Amsterdam in the 1970s. And he was very adamant. He said the 20th century is the era of codification of international law, especially of the human rights regime after the Second World War. It is on you, students, to, in the 21st century, to work towards enforcement and accountability of that regime. And that is an ongoing journey that is taking place and that we're witnessing, and that is far from over, and the century is still young. And in that framework, I also believe that the quest for justice for Palestine and Palestinian refugees needs to find its space and its new impetus.
Thank you, Lex.
On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lex. I want to thank Francesca Albanese and Lex Takkenberg, the authors of this seminal second edition, for this really fascinating presentation today.